Hello everyone, welcome back to Shady Oak Ministries. If you could turn with me to Exodus 13, we'll pick up where we left off in the Exodus of Egypt, specifically going into details about the life of Moses. Verse 1 starts with a very interesting concept given the context of it just having followed the Passover regulation and ceremony being written down for Israel so that they would practice this in memoriam of everything that they'd be going through in the future to remember how God had provided for them in this specific set of circumstances. Now, what was the Passover regulation supposed to be? We'll discuss the dating here, but the basic concept was when the 10th plague of Egypt, the last plague to get God's people out of Egypt, by all intents and purposes, no short measure of force, God went through every single home, manifesting himself in the Spirit by him being the one who gives life, having the only one to have the right to take it, took the lives of every single firstborn child in every single household. And the exception was made to the Jewish people, but not like the previous 9 plagues. Because as you remember, on this day, they were supposed to, on the 4th day of the week, raise up, or the first 4 days of this week, raise up a lamb on the 2nd week, the 10th day of the month, up to the 14th day. You would keep this lamb in your home, and then on the 5th day, you would slaughter it, bleed it of its blood, and then eat it. That being practically, of course, the last decent meal that they would have, since they were supposed to be on the move. They'd have to eat it with a staff in their hand, clothes, shoes, ready to go. But also in regards to the fact that this would also be an illustration of Jesus Christ and what he would one day do by giving his life on the 5th day of Passover, and what we would know as Good Friday, and then rising from the dead on the 1st day of the week, the next week. But all these things being pointed out to us, this feast that they would be doing in remembrance to the Passover, the firstborn children were spared. And why? Because the blood of this lamb took their place, and the blood of it was marked on the doors to their homes. And therefore God spared their lives because the lamb was their substitute. And noting the similarity to the cross, having no need of imagination to figure out, we get to this feast being consecrated and being put in Israel's archives as essentially their first unique holiday, and for very specific reasons, so that they would recognize the Messiah when he came. But before we get into what they would be eating, we actually discuss the concept of how the Messiah would be coming and why it was significant, paralleling the Passover. So verse 1 of chapter 13 says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Consecrate to me, set apart, all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine." So this point being mentioned about a Jewish tradition being established, that the firstborn child of every family, and we'll go more into detail about this when we get into the book of Leviticus, the law of Moses pertaining to the Levites, the ones who would be offering the sacrifices and judging Israel and so forth. We actually get a hint to the Messiah, the anointed one of Israel, in that the firstborn child was, in of a sense, spared by God, and therefore someone who saves your life, for those of you who have first-person shooter etiquette, now owes you your life. And God is, in a sense, calling this out on the card. Now, because I didn't kill you when I should have, because I allowed you guys to have a substitute, and note, God was doing this out of pure mercy, but as well an example and an illustration of what the Messiah would ultimately come here to do, because that's God's nature. He wasn't denying the facts. I spared your firstborn child, therefore every single firstborn belongs to me. Now, this is significant in the fact that we have no shortage of biblical examples of individuals who were not only of great spiritual impact, but also were of the firstborn of every household. We know the prophet Samuel was the firstborn child, and born by very similar and miraculous means to that of Jesus. We know that the judge Samson, the world's first superhero for all intents and purposes, was gifted by God with this supernatural strength, but also was given to the mother of Samson when she made the oath that I will consecrate him to you as a Nazarene, one set aside to honor God. That's why he had the 7 dreadlocks. He wouldn't cut his hair. John the Baptist was also the firstborn of a household, born under very interesting sets of circumstances, and most of all, Jesus would ultimately be the one to fulfill this law of the firstborn, that the firstborn into every household would be set aside and consecrated for God. They would be set aside and special. They belong to me because I spared their lives. And this would become a rule of thumb for every household that actually gave birth to a child for the first time. They would have to provide ransom money, a half a shekel, which we'll get into monetary value when we discuss actually the ransom money when the temple and the tabernacle are being consecrated. That'll be in Exodus, I believe it's 26, but don't quote me on that. We'll get to the study when we can. All these individuals being held under the rule of the firstborn, that God is essentially stacking the deck in his favor, that not only in passages like Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 tell us where Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, passages like Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 2 describing his character, and chapter 7 and verse 14 describing the circumstances of his birth, being virgin born, and as well many other passages that relate to the Messiah, over 300 of them in fact. This being one of them, that the one that would be anointed and used specially by God in a family belonged to him first phase because he was the firstborn child, and because in context of the Passover, literally being the verses right before this, we see how that would make sense, that God spared the life of this child, therefore he belongs to me. So, going to verse 3 and on to verse 10, we get into how the feast of the Passover would actually go as a whole, and we'll get into the dates here as well. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by the strength of hand of the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten, and on this day you are going out in the month of Abib." Now this was the first month of the Jewish calendar and year. It is also referred to as Nisan. "And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, Jebusites, the Canaan land, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters, so get rid of it even in your house. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you on your hand, as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth." Based off of what you saw, it would come out so forth. "For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in season from year to year." So this Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first for all intents and purposes holiday, the holy day of Israel, that would be unique to them as a nation, would be in remembrance of this event when God spared their lives from the 10th plague of Egypt. And the month of Abib, which to us, for those of you who are familiar with the Jewish calendar, where our Gregorian calendar, the 365 and a quarter day of the year system, is actually based off of a solar cycle, our complete lap around the sun counts as 1 year for us. The Jews would actually measure their months based off of a lunar cycle. Based off of every single full moon, it would remark itself as the first of that month. And the interesting thing is that the month Abib, the month Nisan, the first month of the Jewish calendar, following Yom Kippur, their Jewish New Year, the Day of Atonement, was around, to us, late March and early April. So it also aligned well with the seasons, just around the time of spring. And this observation that they'd be required to do is, in remembrance of this, they would have nothing with leaven in their entire homes. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with leaven, you take baking classes, you would know this is yeast. And yeast is something that you would mix into bread to cause it to rise. It's a bacteriological substance that when you mix it in with the bread, no matter how small or how large, when it's baked and produced, or exposed rather, to high temperatures, it dies, and its death produces bursts of oxygen, which is why if you cut open a pastry like a donut, you'd know, you could tell there was yeast in it because you see the flaky bubbles in between all of the dough. that caused it to be so expansive, as opposed to, say, a cracker or a tortilla. If you guys go to your local supermarkets, actually, and you go to the Jewish counter section, and you see matzah bread, it's actually a small wafered cracker, and traditionally they are also, if you look, striped and pierced, not holding much to the imagination as far as what that is in relation to. And note, Jews were doing that before Christians came on the scene. So, God's stacking the deck in his favor with that as well. But essentially, you'd be required not only to only eat tortillas and crackers for the entire week, but you would even sweep your house free from this leaven, having nothing to do with it for that entire time of your life. Now, is God against, donuts and stuff? Well, in a sense, because they're not healthy for you, but a donut every now and then isn't a bad thing. But what God's beef isn't with yeast, but what yeast is going to represent. Because consistently throughout Scripture, yeast has always been in similitude to sin in the life of an individual, that no matter how small and how insignificant its influence is in your life, once it is exposed to heat, to the pressures of life, it produces death in your members and causes you to get risen. It causes you to produce arrogance instead of humility, and thus putting barriers between you and your relationship with God. Now, these parallels all going back to the point as being something that Jesus himself used constantly as a reference. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees, and the disciples thought he was talking about, you forgot to bring bread. And Jesus is like, no, it's their hypocrisy that I'm warning you about, because it doesn't take a lot to really change your life. God didn't want anything that would be ultimately a symbol of this. Leaven being a symbol of sin, and again, the spotless lamb that would be sacrificed on that final day of the week, that feast day, the fourth day of the week, and then again continuing on, would always associate itself with salvation from death, and regarding to, because the lamb died, you didn't have to. Ultimately, when Jesus said, or when John the Baptist said about Jesus, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he was being pointed out as the Passover lamb. And that ultimately when Jesus, like we talked about in the previous study, fulfilled the prophecy of the Passover lamb, he said, "Eat, for this is my body broken for you," regarding the unleavened bread, his sinless body. And as well the cup, the wine that they would drink, he said, "This is my blood in remembrance of you. Drink, and you know that by it we have salvation." Now again, communion is a wonderful remembrance of God's interaction with our lives, but the spiritual reality has to happen before the physical can be remembered. So understand the difference. Communion doesn't save anybody. It's just simply remembering how we were saved. But it's the same principle as to why the people of Israel would have to remember these things, and why God said, tell your kids. Make sure everyone in the future remembers this day. Why? Because there would come a day when, as that child would ask, "Daddy, why are we only eating tortillas and crackers?" Well, it's because we didn't have enough time to let the bread rise. We were in a hurry. Well, why? Because we were freed from our slavery in Egypt. Just like in the day that Jesus would fulfill this, he said, well, our world is falling and passing away, and we are in bondage to sin, but God has freed us. Therefore, we no longer have to take part in the leavened bread of this world anymore. So, the symbols to remember for the future: leaven be a symbol of sin, spotless lamb a symbol of salvation, a salvation specifically from death. These holidays, these holy days, would be well worthwhile to keep in your memory banks as we're reading future passages in Scripture that mention these concepts, because, of course, the law of first mentions in hermeneutics, the doctrine of scriptural interpretation in so many big words, brings these things up as a very important fact to remember. And God will then go into details again about what we talked about concerning the firstborn, and I'll just read the passages to you because it does a better job explaining than I do. "And it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you that your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall be set apart to the Lord, all that open in the womb. That is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's." Now, what gender was Jesus? Regardless of what Tumber tells you, he was male. "But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. So God takes this principle seriously. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So it shall be when your son asks you in the time to come, saying, What is this? That you shall say to him, By the strength of hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb. But the firstborn of my sons I redeem. Now here's the reference I was noting about. It shall be on a sign on your hand as the frontlets between your eyes. It will be just as obvious as the face in front of your nose. For by the strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So, this law of the firstborn is emphasized in further detail as to why God would set them apart. Not only that he specifically notes the males in regarding what his Messiah, what his son, what his manifestation among men would ultimately be, but how God used even the most difficult and frightening of circumstances for his glory. That because Pharaoh literally forgot everything that he saw in regards to God's plan for the children of Israel and refused to be a positive part of it, he instead chose to be a recipient of that grief, and in a sense ended up turning the Red Sea red eventually. But we'll get to that in a few chapters. Now note, this repetition was, in a sense, very, very reasonable, because just like the blood of the Lamb dying in their place spared them from death, so we have the same concept in regarding our salvation, since Jesus took our place in the same regard, and that he was that firstborn lamb that was sacrificed so that the son, our children, wouldn't have to. And especially in regards to the fact that I'm of that category, I'm very grateful. So, verse 17, when it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that it was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So he was buried in a pyramid for all intents and purposes, but he said, I want to be buried with my ancestors. I want to follow the same promises that my father Jacob did when he requested to be buried in the promised land, in the territory that he bought when he was living in that region. And Joseph said, when we leave Egypt, I want you to take my bones with you. So they did. So they took their journey from Sukkoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So the reason they went to the Red Sea instead of through Sinai right away, if you guys want to bring up a map in a separate tab, you would know that Egypt, for all intents and purposes, is at the top right-hand corner of Africa, in the border between the Middle East and Africa. And the Middle East is actually separated from Africa by this small upside-down triangle of a region that is known today as Sinai. Now, it's not a separate country, it's just technically considered a part of Egypt, but the point stands. Why didn't the Israelites just take that 2-week trip that would go right between and a straight shot to them? Well, first off, there's a reason why God was going to use Israel as an instrument of judgment on Canaan. He had given them 600 years plus to repent of the infant sacrifice, the bestiality, the homosexuality, the wanton murder and slaughter that was a prevalent part of their culture in the worships of the pagan deities Moloch, Ashtoreth, and Baal. But also in regards to the fact that when they weren't busy butchering themselves, they were killing each other, and the children of Israel had no military experience whatsoever. And note, this wouldn't stop God. We can read in the book of Joshua how they had very interesting military victories under very interesting circumstances, i.e. Jericho, Gideon, and the rest. But also with this in regard, when we're not talking about snowball fights with meteors and him having the same accurate consistency with those snowballs as Will Ferrell did in Elf, it wasn't military caution that God was concerned about. It was their willingness to obey him that he was considering. That the reason why they were delayed 40 years in the wilderness when a journey by foot, even with 3 to 4 million people, including women and children with all of their clothing and belongings and such, would take about a 2-week journey by foot. It took them 4 years because they weren't willing to trust God to enter in the first time, which again we'll talk about when we get to the book of Numbers. But with this also in regard, if you want to take another look at that map, where they crossed over, where Moses parted the Red Sea, it was a region that is known, and it'll be mentioned here in a few verses, called Pi-Hahiroth, which is the canal that leads. The Red Sea is one of the bodies of water that separates this triangle from the Middle East. And when they would go in from this little triangle, they crossed over at one of the bottom points from Africa to the back of this triangle, because as you know, Mount Sinai is at the bottom of that. That's where Moses was staying in the land of Midian during those 40 years, and also why God said, you're going to leave this place. That's where Moses met God in the burning bush. You're going to leave this place, but you're also going to come back, and you're going to bring my people with you. He made him that promise. But going back to how God provided for the people in the wilderness, you're familiar with the manna and with the quail and with all of those other provisions, speaking to the rock and it producing enough water to, and clean water at that, to provide for the needs of the children of Israel. But also with this very interesting thing, what's the one thing you got to worry about more than anything else in the desert? At day or night, it's shade and it's heat. Now, did Israel have to constantly be building fires and looking for driftwood and stuff? No, because at night, God manifested himself in a pillar of fire. And his presence was actually manifested as such that he would provide warmth for the people of Israel without harming them. Of course, when they rebelled against him, they ended up on the receiving end, like Egypt is about to. But also during the day, how did God manifest himself? In fire? No, in a cloud. And a cloud so low, it was, for all intents and purposes, almost like a fog that shielded them from the effects of nature and supernaturally preserved even their clothing from falling apart. Because, for those of you who know, clothing and materials don't last forever, especially when you're walking frequently. It was a wonder that their shoes held out, let alone their pants, shirt, robes, and such. But also with this in regard, you see that Moses wasn't the one leading the people of Israel in the wilderness. You're probably familiar with the Jim Gaffigan joke that after a year of wandering in the desert, you'd say, this Moses doesn't know where the heck he's going. No, it's right around this corner, I tell you. No, where Israel went was where the pillar went. And where Israel stopped is where the pillar stopped. So for all intents and purposes, they weren't following Moses' direction. They were following a tornado. A windless one at that, but a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that would provide, protect, and rejuvenate the people of Israel through its presence. They weren't chasing a bird. They were literally provided for by the presence of God. And he manifested himself to them in this way, just like he would one day do in human flesh through his Son. And this doesn't limit God by any means, but regarding the law of the firstborn, regarding his provision through warfare, regarding his consideration of their confidences in him, because God can't use you if you don't want to follow him. He doesn't force himself on anybody. He could if he wanted to, but that goes against his nature of being loving, because love offers a second option. He wanted to take them through because this would not only be a fine demonstration of how God would provide for them, just like he demonstrated the same thing to the people of Joshua's day, where they parted the Jordan River and crossed over on dry land. They would get the same chance, except this would be the first time to know that God is not stopped by obstacles such as massive bodies of water, or in regards to a very significant obstacles such as food and clothing. But keeping all these things in mind, in chapter 14, The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth and Migdol at the sea. Opposite Baal-zephon, you shall camp before it by the sea. Again, geography that you probably wouldn't know. I wouldn't have either if I didn't do the research, but it's right at the bottom edge of this triangle that they would ultimately come to and cross over to meet the Lord at the mountain known as Sinai. For Pharaoh will say, note, calling out future before it happens, to the children of Israel, or of them rather, they are bewildered by the land. They're lost, and the wilderness has closed them in. They have their backs to the ocean. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, the 10th time now. Just like the first 5 times, God matched it, so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord, and they did so. So Pharaoh had, in a sense, some buyer's remorse and resorted to alleviate it through butchery. But God's going to say, this didn't catch me off guard, and I'm going to use this to really show them who's the God of the earth. So, it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, Why have we done this? We have let Israel go from serving us. We just lost all of our slave labor. Now we have to do work. So he made ready his chariot, and he took his people with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots, the tanks of their day, and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with boldness. So the Egyptians pursued them, and all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, camping by the sea besides Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. So they're on the edge of Africa, essentially, right next to this triangle, and separated by the very expansive body of water known as the Red Sea. And note, ignorant geologists trying to disprove the Bible, not catching the very clear instructions as to where this specifically was. It was very close to the top, where the body of water was impassable by human means. Even if it had dried out, even if it wasn't in flood season. We know this was in April, early April, late March. So it wasn't during the shallow season. And mind you also, it was a very, very unpredictable area of the ocean. Just pouring in from the Jordan River, it was a very active body of water, and it's not something that they could swim over, especially let alone men, women, and children. But also in regards to the mountains that would enclose them in, Pharaoh's like, well, it's time for some payback for all that you've cost us, Israel. Not putting together the last 4 times. This didn't work out so well. And also paying the consequences for the first 5 times that he denied God's authority in his life. He's now getting to pay in full the cost of his arrogance, and God is making up his mind for this to match every single time he made up his mind against God. So Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, so they were very afraid, I bet. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, now, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. So, this is the first, actually, of Israel's whining and doubting God, even though things looked bad in the moment. God had already told them what was going to happen. And that's an important thing to note, that faith is not when you know something blindly, but when you trust something to be a fact. C.S. Lewis defined it as such, and Hebrews 11 would confirm it's the evidence of things hoped for, or the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And in regarding the facts being placed here, that God had been faithful to keep his promises, he says the Nile River is going to be turned to blood when Pharaoh denies to let you go. The river turned to blood. Frogs are going to come. Frogs came. Lice are going to come. Lice came. Hail's going to fall, but it won't hit Goshen. Hail fell, but it didn't hit Goshen. Darkness is going to fall, and darkness so thick you're going to be able to feel it, so much so it hurts. And it fell. But not on the land of Goshen. All these things being pointed out to us, Israel had plenty of facts. God had told them, Pharaoh's going to harden his heart. Pharaoh's going to come after you, but I'm going to protect you. Regardless, their lack of faith wasn't that they didn't have facts, but that they refused to trust them. And if you know God well enough, if you have trouble with your faith, you have trouble trusting God, it's because you don't know him well enough. Because if you know what God's done in the past, if you know what God's going to continue to do in the future, of course you're going to trust him because he's always done exactly what he said. And when he says, I will never leave you and forsake you, the most mature sign of a Christian is one who's been around with God long enough to say, you know what? He's been faithful before, he'll continue to be now. And that's a lesson we would do well to learn. Moses had learned this lesson. Even though he was a whiner, he was a doubter, he was the guy who spent the good majority of the first push into Egypt to get Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go. God finally got his attention, and Moses had finally taken a hint. And in verse 13, he said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. That's a good rule of thumb. Don't go on your own instinct, strength, and resources to defend yourself. Let God defend you, because even if they kill you, he's got you covered. So, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? That's funny. Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Don't just stand there. I want you to move. I want you to do something. Let me do something through it. But lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground. That's interesting. Through the midst of the sea. And I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So, if the first 10 plagues weren't enough a sign that God is not to be trifled with, certainly this isn't going to stop them. And indeed, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God, now this is cool, Yahweh Malakim, God as a messenger, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud, the thing that was giving them shade and warmth at night, this pillar went behind them and stood behind them, in between Israel and the Egyptians. So now God's standing between them. This is cool. And thus was a cloud and a darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other. Whoa. Well, hold on. This cloud stood between the children of Israel, and on one side it gave light at night, but on the other half it produced that same darkness. Isn't that interesting? When you stand on the receiving end of God's judgment, it's not a fun time. All you have is darkness. All you have is confusion. All you have is panic. But if you're on the defending end, it's comfort, even when God is judging. I think that's awesome. So, this very interesting delaying action done by God on the Egyptian army, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall between them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Note, they had a good head start, I bet. But God allowed them to enter in once they had made enough distance. Now it came to pass in the morning watch, between around, I believe the watch system was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., just before sunrise, that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he took off their chariot wheels. So they were charging in, and God screwed up the horses' coordination. Any of you guys who've ridden horses, this isn't too uncommon a circumstance, but for all of them to do it at once, that's interesting. And he took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." So God essentially immobilizes all of their tanks halfway into the ocean. And they're like, maybe this was a bad idea. And then what happened? The Lord said to Moses, verse 26, "Stretch out your hand back over the sea, that the waters may come back on the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh, and it came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land, were in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And the Lord saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So let's do a quick recap here. Jesus pre-incarnated fights the battle for Israel while they're busy crossing this very interesting little skyhook. And the Egyptians, being immobilized, finally recognize that what they were doing was stupid. And trusting two factors on very interesting sets and terms, God says, don't think the ocean is a barrier. Run towards it. I'll split it. Israel crosses the Red Sea on dry land. Now, a lot of people have come to the reasonable reinterpretation of this passage that, oh, well, the Red Sea is actually a mistranslation of what's called the Reed Sea. And, you know, it's like a real southern, more like lake, river type deal. It's more like a stream more than anything else. And during this time of the year, you know, because of the flood seasons being kind of erratic, it makes it so it becomes very shallow in certain parts, even almost non-existent, flowing out in certain places where it would seem like it was dry land. And to that, I really, really admire their faith, because if they can believe that not only was this not the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea, in the Bible's consistent historical clarity, even when it went into details of the cities and the regions in which they were camping out in, so they could know exactly where they would have crossed over in historical antiquity, but that God managed to drown the entire Egyptian army in 3 inches of water. Very interesting. So, considering a second point of this, let's recap back to chapter 2 of Exodus, verses 11 through 15, when Moses failed to save Israel, or a person in Israel, from one Egyptian. And when he tried to bury the body in the sand, he failed. People found out about it anyway and became a murderer. What happened here? Well, Moses buried the entire Egyptian military, successfully, mind you, that were threatening all of Israel. And he successfully saved them. They would never be whipped again. What was Moses missing at the beginning of this book? Who had he gained after a certain incident where he talked with something that shouldn't be talking? If you have God on your side, you can accomplish far more of your life's calling, your destiny, and your desires than you would ever be able to give yourself credit for. Understand, when Moses took matters into his own hands, he became a murderer. But when he left it in God's hands, what a difference he made. Because as Jesus said in Luke chapter 18 and verse 27, the things which are impossible with men are possible with God. Now, how could a ragtag group of slaves defeat the entire Egyptian army, fully charioted out and everything? Well, let me answer that question with a question. How could humanity be forgiven completely of its sin and be given eternal life through simple belief in his promises? Without God, no way. With God, Yahweh. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the topics that we've discussed, such as God's provision for the people in the wilderness, if you'd like to discuss the passages in Leviticus regarding the ransom terms of the firstborn, or just maybe questions about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or any sincere questions you have about the topics we've discussed, leave them in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to talk about them with you. If you'd like to know how this faith-based system worked, and you'd like to know not only the same God who parted the Red Sea, but is willing to part death itself and stand between the gap for you, a God capable of not only still providing warmth for the people of Israel, causing them to pass through all but an ocean on dry land, but also being willing to return you to him regardless of what you think you've done to not deserve him. Leave them in the comments below. It only takes a prayer. It only requires you to ask. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps doesn't know these stories in their entirety, doesn't know why God should be considered trustworthy with their lives, please share this study with anyone and everyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. And again, remember, God's not only worth trusting with his word, but one word in particular, that he loves you.